Hi, my name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here at Kings Harbor, and thank you so much for utilizing this resource. Our hope for you in anything that we provide is that you would expect transformation, that we could demonstrate love towards you because of the love of God demonstrated to us, that you would have the faith stirred in you to deal with obstacles and to see opportunities, and that ultimately that the kingdom of God would be revealed in every area of your life. And so our hope with this resource is that the Lord would speak to you powerfully.
If you got a Bible, go to Galatians chapter 1. As you turn there, this morning is going to feel a little bit different in terms of the way that we end service. Obviously, it feels a little bit different already. We didn't do confession. Some of you are like, wait a minute. Others of you are like, wait a minute. I'm never here on time for that, so I didn't know that we missed anything. So with that in mind, as we jump to Galatians, I just want to invite you to pray for me this week. I am jumping on an airplane tomorrow morning to go preach a youth conference in Cleveland, Tennessee. Not to be confused with Cleveland, Ohio, because the first time I tried to book tickets there, I almost ended up in Cleveland, Ohio, and that would have been awkward when I walked in and this is the wrong city. And so I'll fly in Monday, get there Monday night, pray for me that I don't miss my flights and that I get there on time, unlike last time, and then preach Tuesday morning, hang for the rest of the day, and then fly out on Wednesday. And so, just be praying for me because it feels like a whirlwind trip. Pray for my wife because she gets the whirlwind of our two kids. So there's that. As we jump in this morning, we're going to be in Galatians 1, continuing verses 11 through 17. And as we do that, I think there's probably a little bit of a pressing question that is going to exist, at least for the next few weeks as we walk through Galatians. Because what we're going to read is going to be really specific to Paul. It's going to be autobiographical, and in some ways it's going to feel even a little bit like a memoir in the sense of it's just a sliver of his life that he's focusing on to try and tell you this message out of the happenings of his life. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't apply to you. As far as I know, none of you have opposing teachers who are showing up and trying to invalidate your Christian credibility, say that you have a false gospel, and say that you're a people pleaser. I don't know that to be the case for you. If that is the case, then this does directly apply. And so there's some sense of, how do we make sense of what we're reading? And not only how do we make sense of what we're reading, but why does it matter? And so I just want to take a moment, almost like a movie trailer, and take a second and kind of give you a preview of what's going to be happening in the next few weeks. One, to give you some insight into what we're going to be walking through, but two, hopefully to begin to draw some value out of what's happening. And so here's what you're going to see. The structure of Galatians 1:11 through 2:14 prove that Paul's gospel came from Christ and not from human teaching or human invention or influence. And what we're going to see is over those nearly full chapter, we're going to see this kind of breakdown. And so today we'll look at 11 through 17. And so in 11 and 12, we're going to see kind of this thesis statement, Paul's opening idea. Hey, I received this from Christ, not anyone else. And then in verses 13 through 17, we're going to see the story of Paul's conversion and ultimately that he didn't rush to go get approved by anybody else, but that came from the Lord. And then in verses 18 through 24, that's where we'll be next week. It'll talk about when he finally does go to Jerusalem after 3 years. And when he gets there, it's not because they need to teach him anything, but because he wants to build a relationship there. And then we'll see in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, Paul will go back to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, they're going to agree these are the fundamentals of the gospel. This is what has to be true if the gospel is going to be present, but he's not necessarily needing them to approve of him. And then in verses 11 through 14, we get to see him confronting Peter about his actions at Antioch and how they're contrary to the gospel. And so even you knowing that still doesn't answer the question, why does this matter? Because at the end of the day, if we just take a historical view of Galatians and talk about the things that Paul went through, that doesn't make sense, but it doesn't make sense for necessarily your daily life and what you're facing. But here's what I hope you see. One, I pray that the Lord stirs this confidence in the way that you've been called to him and what he's called you to as we read this. Second, what I hope is that there is this really clear picture for you out of this story of Paul, that the Lord is doing something bigger, which each one of our stories that goes far beyond you, far beyond me, far beyond our direct circle, that he's doing something in the larger story of redemption. And so here's our main idea this morning. The strength of the gospel is not found in the presenter or the presentation. It's found in the revelation of Jesus as the hope for the world. So let me pray, and we'll jump in. So Jesus, I thank you. I thank you for your word. I thank you that it by itself stands above any individual's story or ability to convey the story. It stands above a context or a culture or a medium, that in and of itself, the revelation that you came, suffered a sinner's death, was raised as a vindication to prove that you were the faithful Son of God, and that now you are remaking the world and inviting us into it, that message in and of itself finds its strength in itself. Would you stir confidence in us in that message? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 11, would say this: "For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, and I was not taught it, but it came by a revelation of Jesus Christ." Now, this feels like we're backing up to all the way to Galatians 1:1, where he starts the letter and says, hey, I'm Paul, an apostle, not by man or not by men, but instead by Christ, who God raised from the dead. Like, it seems like he's repeating himself a little bit, though there he was talking about his authority, but here he's talking about that actually the message that I speak. If you were with us last week, we talked about that there's this tension that's going on in those churches that were planted in that area of Galatia, that there was this opposition that was telling them, hey, what you heard from Paul was not the true gospel. And Paul's like, no, this different gospel, this placebo that they're giving you, it might feel good, it might make life easier for you, but it actually has no effect because it's not the gospel at all. And so now he's beginning to defend, here's what that message is. Here's how I received that message. And he says, hey, I didn't receive this message of human origin. It seems like he's trying to defend against this idea that either one, that he made this up himself, or two, somebody else taught him and he got it wrong. It's almost this argument, hey, I'm not a copy of a copy. And so nowadays, we scan things with our phones, and so that's not a problem. But back in the day, there used to be this big thing called a copy machine. And you would take a piece of paper and you would copy it. And then if you needed more copies, you'd make copies of the copy. And then you make copies of the copy. And eventually, it just got so degraded that you actually didn't have a quality image anymore because you were just diminishing the quality of the image every time that you used a lesser version of it to make the next copy. And Paul's argument here is what you're hearing from me is not a diminished version of the gospel that I learned from somebody else, because in fact, I received it directly from the Lord. If you were with us a few weeks ago, Johnny walked through the start of Paul's story and how he was on this road to Damascus, and he had letters in hand to go persecute the church, to drag people off to jail and ultimately drag them off to being killed. And on the road, this bright light shows up. He gets knocked down, and the voice says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I love the way that he responds, because he says, who are you, Lord? Come on, man, you already know the answer. You said it in the question. But there's this moment that he recognizes something bigger than me, something more powerful than me is happening. And he's alluding to this moment. Hey, when I received the message of Jesus, it was not, I listened to some guy tell me a story about what he heard, but I got this directly from him. In fact, if you were to hear how he talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15, he's explaining to them, hey, here's the primacy of the gospel. The gospel is of first importance, and he begins to lay that out. But hear how he talks about it and how he's intentional about what he says. Starting in verse 1, it says this: "Now I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand, and by which you are being saved." And so I love the past, present, future of that you have already received it, you currently stand on it, and it's the thing that will save you in the future. If you hold to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the very same scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, which is another name for Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brothers and sisters at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me. Now, I'm going to keep going here in a second and finish out the last few verses. But here's what he's doing. He's like, hey, I want you to know how important the gospel is, that everything that you believed in the scriptures is fulfilled in this, that Jesus, according to the scriptures, died for our sins, that Jesus, according to the scriptures, was raised to the dead. And then Jesus, as if he didn't have anything to do for like 50 days, was walking around, showing up, hanging out with people. That first he shows up to Peter. And for the readers of that day and age, that Peter's one of those kind of first name all-stars that when you say his name, oh man, yeah, I know Peter. That he appeared to the 12, that he appeared to 500 other people just walking around, showing up at Starbucks and stuff. Like Jesus just had all types of free time. Like after he did his part, like, hey, I've died, I've resurrected, I'm remaking the world. I don't got anything else to do. Let me just make some friends. And then to James, and if you were to know the history of the church, James becomes one of the primary leaders of the church. In fact, as you read the book of Galatians, you'll see Peter's name mentioned, but you'll also say men who would claim that they are from James. And so these are people who came from Jerusalem saying, hey, I come on behalf of the leader of the church saying, you can't do this. And so for Jesus to appear to Peter is a big deal. For Jesus to appear to 500 other people is a big deal. For Jesus to appear to James, who's going to be the future leader of the church, that's a big deal. And then, oh, by the way, in the same way he appeared to them, as one who was out of sync with history, who was born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me. It's as if to say, I'm on the same playing field as them. In case they didn't catch that, he would go on to say this, starting in verse 9, for I am the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, so we proclaim, and so you have believed. And so he said, hey, I just want to take it out of the air. Like my background would probably disqualify me from being their equal. The way that I persecuted the church, the way that I was actually an opponent of them, that should disqualify me. But yet God saw fit to give me grace, and it motivated me to work hard. And so whether it's they that preach, those that you would see as the pillars of the church, or me who came out of the wrong setting and the wrong time, that either way, that's an equal playing field, because what I receive from God is the same thing they receive from God. He's making a point here that, hey, I didn't get this from anybody else. I got it straight from the source. And then he even uses this word, revelation. Now, depending on your background, if you grew up in church, you hear the word revelation, you think about a book of the Bible that you don't read at night when a storm is going on because it freaks you out a little bit. But that word in and of itself just means to unveil something that's hidden. And so for Paul to say that I did not receive this gospel by some human teaching or human influence, but instead that God revealed it, that God unveiled what was always there, but we couldn't see plainly. What he'd been doing the whole time, what he'd been doing all the way since back in Genesis 3, when he said, hey, here's how I'm going to rescue you, that the seed of woman is going to crush the head of the serpent, and his heel is going to be bruised, that I'm going to send someone. And we've been waiting all throughout history that person was revealed to me when I was on the road that day, and Jesus said, I'm the one that you're persecuting. That the veil's been pulled back and now I can finally see. And so here's what Paul's doing. He's tying the quality of his message to the source that it comes from. We do that all the time. If you're a vegetarian in the room, you're about to be offended about what I'm about to talk about next. I was on Instagram the other day and I was watching people make steaks. I do that all the time because I imagine one day I want to be that good at making steak. And so there's a guy who's talking about like grass-fed meat versus like pasture-raised meat versus like A5 Wagyu from Japan. And like talking about the quality of the meat comes from where it was sourced from. And he's like you can tell about the different marbling. Marbling is a fancy word for fat. You could tell about the quality of the meat because of the level of marbling, because of the way that it was fed and the way that it was raised, taken care of. And like he's getting into like the last 3 months of this pasture raised that they put him on this instead of this. And I'm like eating it up. I'm like, yeah. And then I'm sitting thinking to myself, I need to go get some A5 Wagyu. And then I started looking at prices for A5 Wagyu and I was like, you know what? Walmart ribeye is pretty good. And so we get the idea of tying the quality of something to the source that it comes from. Maybe if you're not a steak person, maybe you're a coffee person. And nobody's like, I got the best quality coffee. I got it out of this can of Folgers. Like, you don't go to like those really fancy coffee places and they're like, it's been sourced right from the shelves of Target. Where we no, it was picked in this field in the middle of a rainforest and somebody nearly died to get this coffee to you. You're like, oh yeah, this is good coffee. Because the quality is tied to the source. And I just think Paul's doing the same thing. We often tie quality to sourcing. Paul is arguing that his gospel is faithful because it came from the purest source possible, Jesus himself. Now, here's what Paul's not arguing. He's not saying, hey, if Jesus didn't show up to you in the middle of the road and personally reveal himself to you, you therefore don't know him on the level that I know him. But what he's doing is he seems to be answering a tension that's in the text. One of the things that's difficult about Galatians is Paul doesn't come out and say, hey, Billy said that I'm not a faithful apostle, so let me let Billy know. If your name's Billy, that wasn't personal this morning. He's pointing to the reality when he answers things that, hey, here are what these rival teachers or these agitators are bringing up as an opposition against him. And so he's answering the question, hey, don't you guys remember? I want it to be clear for you that I received this message directly from the Lord. Don't forget that. Then he would go on, starting in 13, to begin to take that original statement of saying, hey, my gospel's faithful because I received it directly from the Lord, to show you how that plays out. Verse 13, for you've heard about my former way of life in Judaism. I intensely persecuted God's church and tried to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many contemporaries among my people because I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. I did not go to Jerusalem to those who had become apostles before me. Instead, I went to Arabia and came back to Damascus. And so what Paul's talking about is not just, hey, I was historically Jewish, so that is true. What he's going a step further and talking about, and we've already mentioned this a little bit in talking about his background and reading from that 1 Corinthians 15 text, that he wasn't just historically Jewish. He wasn't like just kind of cultural Jew. He was like, I'm in for this thing. In fact, that language, extremely zealous. When we talk about somebody being zealous, we get a little nervous about somebody being zealous. In fact, maybe the only time you've ever used the word zealous is when you've talked about somebody being overzealous. Like, I don't know in our culture that we have appropriate zealous or underzealous. I think we only talk about overzealous. And so it has this thing about, man, this person is a maniac about this thing. But in that culture, to be zealous means that you were working to adhere to the purest sense of their faith, and you were not going to let that go. In fact, there were historical examples where that word zeal was used to approve of somebody who took whatever action necessary to uphold the faithfulness of God. So one of the stories that you're probably aware of, if you've been around the church, is there's a man named Elijah. And in Elijah's day and age, there was the number of prophets that were faithful to the Lord were so slim that at one point he was like, Lord, I'm the only one left. But there's a moment where he versus a multitude of prophets of Baal are having this moment where they're trying to prove whose God is the real God. And so they both lay sacrifices on the altar. And what they say is, whoever's God brings fire down to consume the sacrifice, that God is the real God. And so the prophets of Baal are dancing and chanting and even cutting themselves, trying to get their God's attention. And then in a case of the best Old Testament trash talk that you can come up with, Elijah's like, hey, maybe you should scream louder. Maybe he's asleep. Maybe he's in the bathroom. And nothing happens. And then Elijah prays, and his prayer is that you would show all of these people that you are the true God. And fire comes from heaven and begins to consume him sacrifice. And then it points to that the zeal of Elijah was part of why that happened. Zeal wasn't a bad thing. Zeal was commitment to what was good. Or maybe a story that you're less familiar with is there's a man named Phineas, and Phineas is praised in the Psalms for being zealous and being faithful, and is actually considered righteousness unto him because of what he does. What he does, back in Numbers, is he finds an Israelite who is having an unfaithful relationship with an idol worshiper, and he kills them both. You guys are like, oh, that dropped in a way I didn't expect it to. But zeal for him was to uphold the law of God so tightly that even if it caused him to be violent, that he was being faithful. And Paul would say, I was that type of follower, that I was going to do whatever it took to uphold what God had given to us. I wasn't going to let anybody water down or degrade or make a copy out of a copy of what our faith was supposed to be. And so I was zealous and I was willing to persecute the church for it. And then almost as if it was like, hey, bro, you just said this. But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by grace, was pleased to reveal his son in me. But I don't want to move that past that too fast because like we're on the other side of history. And so we're like, oh, well, of course you were called, Paul. We got Acts. We know how that happened. Of course you were called. But he's not just saying that to say it. He's also using some really intentional language there. That language of called from my mother's womb, set apart from my mother's womb, he's not just saying, hey, even before I was born, the Lord had an awareness of me. He's actually quoting two Old Testament prophets. And so one of those is Isaiah chapter 49. Isaiah 49 would say it this way. Once you get it past the who he's calling to, he would say in the second part of the verse, the Lord called me before I was born. He named me while I was in my mother's womb. And this is Isaiah talking about the servant that God was going to send into the world to make the world right and draw the nations back to him. That this was a big deal. And so for somebody to read that you are putting yourself at least in the vein of being like the servant that was supposed to help redeem the world, and that you were called from your mother's womb, that you were known by God before you were born. That's not accidental language. That's saying God was doing something to fulfill something, and I'm part of that. Or Jeremiah 1:5 would say it this way. This is the Lord speaking. I chose you before I formed you in the womb. I set you apart before you were born. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Again, similar language of before born, in utero, the Lord knowing him and calling him. That's what he was saying to Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, that I'm using you and going to use your voice to call the nations to know me. And Paul would say that this is what was happening to me in the middle of my zeal, in the middle of trying to uphold the history that Jeremiah was suffering for, trying to uphold the history that the suffering servant came out of, that the Lord called me and said, hey, I'm doing something bigger than what you think you're supposed to be doing. I'm calling you to be this voice to reach the nations, to preach to the Gentiles. And he said, and so when it gave the Lord good pleasure, he revealed the Son not to me, but in me. Prepositions matter. Because before it was here's what I saw, but now it's here's what I've become. That when he called me, that it wasn't just a call to a vocation, but he was changing something in me, that he might change something through me. Then he said, so I didn't consult with anyone. If we were reading this in the original Greek, and it's not that I can, I just have a Bible program that does that for me, that anyone would say flesh and blood. As if it was echoing that moment when Jesus was asking the disciples, hey, who do men say that I am? Well, some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist come back from the dead. Well, who do you say that I am? And in a moment of Peter getting it right, he says, you're the Son of the living God. And the Lord's response to him is, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you. As if to say, if you're consulting with humans, if you're consulting with mere flesh and blood, it is not the same as something being revealed to you by God. And Paul would say, I didn't go consult with flesh and blood, but this was revealed to me by God. So instead, I went to Arabia, and then I went back to Damascus. This is unique to Galatians. If you're reading through Acts chapter 9, like it doesn't say, and then Paul went to Arabia. Part of that is because of us understanding the political climate, that the way that the region was named was Arabia. And so part of that was South Syria, which is where Damascus would have been. But part of that is he's saying something unique to them. And so there are two theories about what his time was in Arabia. He doesn't tell us, but people who are smarter than me, who sit around and think about these things a lot longer than I do, so it looks like there's one of two things that happened there. One of them is that he started to be on mission. Seems to make sense. If you read the book of Acts, it seems like the Lord shows up to him. He's blind for a few days. Ananias heals him. He jumps up and begins to proclaim the gospel. And so if he went to Arabia, it makes sense that he would continue to do that. In fact, if you read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I believe, he makes a statement that the governor of Arabia tried to guard against him getting into the city. So it seems like maybe that's what was happening during that time period. I don't know. Could be. The other theory is this, that it was a time of reflection for him. So the way that he'll talk about Arabia one more time in this book, and he talks about Mount Sinai being in Arabia. Mount Sinai is the place where when Moses very first was called by God, he goes to Mount Sinai, and this is where he sees the burning bush. Mount Sinai is the same place that all of the Israelites returned to after getting out of Egypt, and the Lord lays the law before them and says, this is how you're being called to be my people. I've rescued you. Now I'm pulling you into covenant to be my people, and this is where they get the 10 Commandments. Mount Sinai is also known as Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is the place that Elijah goes to, where after he has had this moment where he's been zealous for the Lord, and he's killed all these prophets of Baal and proved that his God is God, and then he's freaking out because he thinks that his life is going to end, that he goes, and this is where the still small voice whispers to him, I've got more for you to do than what you've always done. I don't know if it's one or the other or both, but I certainly like the symmetry of the second one. That this zealous guy who thought that he was doing the right thing for God goes back to this historic place that God has always been at work amongst his people, revealing his purposes beyond what they thought they were trapped in, and says to him, hey, I got something more for you than what you thought. I'm calling you to something bigger. I'm doing something more definitive than what you thought you were doing before. So I wrote it this way. Paul's confidence is not in his pedigree or his competency. There are other times that Paul would lay that out. He would say, like, do you know where I come from? That I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews, that I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. So in that day and age, because tribe of Benjamin is where the first king of Israel came from, Saul, that would be like saying, I'm directly related to George Washington. He's not. He didn't say that here. He would talk about that I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, that I was more learned, that I've never committed sin, that I've been blameless against the law. He didn't lay down his competency. He didn't lay down his pedigree. His confidence is in the fact that he knows who called him. He knows that the Lord called him out of his zeal into, what you wanted to do was right. You wanted to introduce people to the faithfulness of God and the goodness of God and invite them in to know the way you were doing is wrong. Let me redirect your efforts, brother. Let me just say to you, whatever it is that the Lord has called you into, your confidence should not be in your pedigree. It should not be the family that you come from, the school that you went to, the friends that you have. That's not going to stand on the day when challenge comes. Nor should it be on in your competency. In the business world, there's a thing called the Peter principle. I think it's actually named after Peter in the scriptures. And the Peter principle says that you will elevate yourself to the point of your incompetence, or you're going to just keep getting promotions until you get yourself promoted into a job that you can't do. And so for all of us, there's a next level that says, if we get up there, we don't know what we're doing. And so if you're thinking, the Lord only called me because I'm fully competent, just walk with the Lord for more than 13 seconds. And you'd be like, don't know what I'm doing at all. So my confidence can't be, here's where I came from. It can't be, here's what I know. It is in who I know and what he called me to do. So what do we do with that? If the strength of the gospel is not found in the presenter or the presentation, but instead it's found in the revelation of Jesus as the hope for the world, what does that mean for us? It means that my calling and your calling is not an individual enterprise. It's part of this bigger story of God's redemption for the world. Let me back up, because maybe I'm assuming something that you don't know yet. You're called. That the Lord, by his grace, decided that he was going to let himself be known to you. That he was going to pull back the veil from your heart and your mind from understanding what he's done, and you've trusted him. If that's not true of you yet, then just understand that's my heart. That's what we pray for week after week, is that you would walk in this place and that the veil would be removed, that there'd be a revelation of who God is, and that you would trust him. But when he saved you, he didn't just save you as an individual enterprise. He's calling you to something. And don't hear calling just as ministry. You're called to be the business owner that you are. You're called to be the educator that you are. You're called to be the student that you are. You're called to be whatever your vein in life is. I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to get beat up like the homeboy who played for the Kansas City Chiefs. Like, you're called to be a homemaker. I'm not getting punched in my mouth today. But the Lord equips you for that too. And if that's the case, then it's not just that you have this individual calling, but he's doing something that's been a part of what he's been doing all along. That's the whole point of what Paul is trying to show to them, that I was called before I was even born, in the same way that the prophets said they would have been, because they were part of this larger story of what God was doing, and he's just unveiling it more and more through each and every one of us. And so the place that you are called into, the thing that you're called to do, the gifts that he's given you, the competency that you do have, the pedigree that you do have, that God has been using all of that to arrange you to be in the particular place that you are, that he might use you to reach specific people and to show that the new creation has come. And that means wherever you are, everybody's eligible. He didn't drop you somewhere and be like, hey, I'm going to send you to these people, but I actually don't want you to say nothing to them. He said, I've done something in you that I might do something through you. And whatever your vocation may be, whatever it is that is on the bottom of your business card, that's a really antiquated reference. Y'all, nobody has business cards anymore. Whatever it is on your email signature that your position is, that's not just the job that you got because you applied and you were better than the other candidates. It's because the Lord called you to that place, and he wants to use you to reveal his goodness to the world, that they might know the message that the Messiah has come and has opened the door of human history to say, I'm inviting you in to be part of my people, not because of your competency, not because of your pedigree, but because of my mercy towards you, that grace is calling you in to see and to know, and that you are evidence of that. This is my prayer for us, is as we continue to walk through this portion of Galatians, that we would know that we have received a faithful source that's given us our calling, and that we in kind would reflect that to the rest of the world. Let me pray. So Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your mercy towards us. Because oftentimes when we think somebody is overzealous, especially overzealous in opposition to our cause, they're an opponent to be defeated, not a friend to be made. And yet what a friend we have in Jesus, that you would invite us in to know and trust you in spite of our foolishness and stubbornness. And then beyond just the gospel on the ground where you transform us, here's the gospel in the air, that you want to change the world around us because of what you are revealing in us. So Lord, help us to be faithful. Even today, would you help us to slow down and go to Arabia if necessary, to reflect on there's something more for us than what we thought. And then would you give us confidence in you as we pursue what you're calling us to? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen and amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.